More than 3 million refugees, an economy in freefall, and more than 50 nations around the world, including the US, demanding the president stand aside to make way for the opposition leader. Venezuela is in a serious crisis. So, is it time for Hugo Chavez's successor, President Nicolas Maduro, to step down? Or will a US-backed change in the government in Caracas constitute a coup? Joining me to debate this are Eva Golinger, a Venezuelan-American lawyer and journalist who served as an advisor to the late President Chavez, and Eli Lake, an American national security and foreign policy columnist for Bloomberg, who says regime change is the only moral option. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Eva, let me start with you. It isn't just the US. You have Canada, France, Germany, the UK, the EU Parliament, Venezuela's neighbors, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador. They have all endorsed Juan Guaido as the new president, the opposition leader. In terms of both the global scene and the regional scene, President Maduro doesn't have much legitimacy left, does he?
He is the current president of Venezuela who's in power. He's in the presidential palace. He won an election last year under, questionable circumstances that can be contested by the opposition. They chose to boycott it for the most part. But he is in power. He has the support up until now of the armed forces, at least at the higher levels. And he has control of the state institutions. So there is also support for Maduro. I mean, absolutely, there are millions of Venezuelans who have supported him and may not be content with the current situation in the country, but don't support, the kind of coup-like situation that's taking place.
Eli, he's the elected president of Venezuela. He's in the presidential palace. Who cares what other countries think?
Well, I don't think he is the elected president of Venezuela. His election didn't pass any kind of international muster. Almost all the countries that you mentioned did not recognize that election. There were significant members of his opposition, most notably Leopoldo Lopez, who was in jail and could not run. The reason that the opposition boycotted that election is because they had seen slowly but surely under Nicolas Maduro's reign, an erosion and an attack on the very powers of Venezuelan democracy, particularly the National Assembly, which he basically neutered and then, sort of revived an old forum and called it his new legislature, which, undermined a very legitimate election in 2015 when Maduro's opposition won a majority in that assembly. That is the basis or the roots of this crisis. So when we talk about is Maduro elected, well, I would say that the election that was held in 2018 was not legitimate. No one recognized it.
But you wouldn't deny that millions of Venezuelans still support this president, would you?
Sure, there are millions of, though I do think that he is losing his support in the areas that were the strongest supporters of Chavez, in part because the entire economy has collapsed. But yeah, there are millions of supporters. He has far less, I think, legitimacy and popular legitimacy than he did before.
You wrote on Twitter last month, Eli, that, quote, regime change is the only moral option in Venezuela right now. You said calls for compromise are delaying the transition to democracy. Given that this phrase regime change,
sure.
We're speaking the week of the anniversary of the Iraq invasion, when invoked in the US, that phrase is associated with Iraq, with Libya, with hundreds of thousands of innocent people being killed. Should people in the US really be talking about regime change in the same sentence as Venezuela?
Well, I think that regime change should be destigmatized. I think it's the outcome that we're talking about. The means by which I support regime change in Venezuela is to have a new election under an interim government and for there to be, a vote, and whoever wins should do that. My issue with Maduro in this particular context is not because I think that the U.S. should invade Venezuela as they did in Iraq. He has usurped power by staying past his first term. And, I don't recognize, as most of the hemisphere doesn't recognize, the last elections.
Okay.
Except
do you disagree with anything that Eli said?
Well, absolutely, because, regardless of my position on Maduro, which is critical, there are millions of Venezuelans who did go to the polls and vote for him and believe that he is their elected president. So the fact that Juan Guaido, who was also elected as a member of the National Assembly, the fact that he's claiming and that the opposition is claiming, and primarily, even though the other countries are involved and present in Latin America and Europe, it's really the Trump administration that is pumping up the opposition. They would not be able to take this as far as they have so far without that open and direct, explicit, and very aggressive support. So I think that's a key factor, because you may have Venezuelans who don't want Maduro as their president. They would like change.
But they don't want a U.S. intervention either.
Absolutely not, nor do they want a U.S. puppet. So they don't, and they see Trump in the same way that many people around the world see Trump, which is this emblematic, figure of U.S. imperialism and capitalism.
Okay,
Well,
Eli,
I'd like to. I think that I would quibble with one thing that you said just then, which is that the original driving force of this entire process was a sort of Venezuelan Supreme Court in exile and what's known as the Lima Group, which the U.S. is not a member of. And so I would say that yes, the Trump administration, by coming out and saying that they supported this, but it was done in consultation with all of these other countries in the region.
but the other countries aren't the ones who might take military action. You say you're not in favor of military action.
I don't think the U.S. will either, but we
know that
debate
Donald Trump and John Bolton don't have an objection to military
Are
intervention.
constantly saying that the option's on the table also
I mean,
as
Donald
a
Trump
threat.
I'm glad we
told the
can bring it
former
up.
acting FBI director, why can't we go to war in Venezuela, quote, they have all that oil and they're right on our back door. That doesn't worry you as someone
Plus, he's
who's
said
writing about
multiple
Venezuela?
times since then that a military option is on the table. He said it just the other day, meeting with the president of Brazil.
I mean, if you were Maduro and you heard that, what would you be doing?
I would say that my understanding from reporting, and I think there's been some public statements to this as well, especially from Elliot Abrams and stuff and so forth, is that they say that all options are on the table in order to dissuade Maduro from doing something rash, such as attacking the U.S. embassy, which is now the U.S. is evacuating its personnel, or from doing something like arresting Guaido. And as we saw this week, we saw the arrest of his chief of staff. So I think that it's mainly a form of public diplomacy. Donald Trump has shown in his broader foreign policy that he does not like committing the United States to wars. In fact, he'd like to brag about ending them. We saw that in Syria. We're seeing that probably soon in Afghanistan.
But we've also seen him make very hawkish noises on Iran and Venezuela. I'm just wondering here, you mentioned Elliot Abrams.
Yeah.
I mean, again, if you're Maduro, if you're a member of the Venezuelan government or a supporter, you see that the point man on Venezuela appointed by the Trump administration is the guy who was involved in Central America under Reagan with El Salvadoran death squads, genocide in Guatemala, etc. Regardless of your own positions on Venezuela, what message is that sending to people in Venezuela?
Also, threats of military action that's not diplomatic discourse. That's war discourse. So, of course, the position of the Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro is going to see that as a direct threat. Why wouldn't they? There have been assassination attempts.
Eli, is it fair to say, well, I want regime change in Venezuela, but I don't support military intervention, given Maduro has the support of the defense minister and the security? He's not going anywhere anytime soon. So if you really wanted to get rid of him, you would get behind kind of Trump, Bolton, Abrams, regime change, military change.
I don't think Abrams and Bolton are spoiling for an invasion.
So why is he holding a notepad saying 5,000 troops?
And
I
also,
think
they've
it's honestly, I think it's a form of
invasions.
psychological warfare. But more importantly,
And that never leads to real war, does it?
but
Okay.
more
They've been involved in
more importantly, I think he's trolling the press and trying to sort of send messages. More importantly, I don't think things are very good for Maduro right now.
Eva, if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, or you're the Prime Minister of the UK, you're the President of France, you see this humanitarian crisis, you see this record number of refugees, you see people taking to the streets protesting the government, you see the opposition leaders saying, well, according to my understanding of the Constitution, I can be interim president. You've already said the election was flawed on behalf of your national government. What are you supposed to do? Just avert your gaze? What would you want them to do?
I think absolutely. There should be diplomatic pressure. There should be efforts to facilitate dialogue, a negotiated process. But again, I mean, there's a crisis in Venezuela, but in not to downplay or underestimate the experiences of any Venezuelans going through hardships, it is not a humanitarian crisis that we would call, for example, Yemen. It's not a situation where we're looking at a famine. Yes, there have been more refugees or an exodus of Venezuelans than ever before in history, but a lot of those are economic refugees, and that's again not to underestimate their own hardships. There is still, you go to Venezuela, and if you go to the remote regions, you're going to see, like more rural, you'll see the impact of the crisis more. But in the city, you still got people, they're going, I mean, if you were to go visit today, you would say, what has the media been telling me?
I mean, the hyperinflation in Venezuela is a humanitarian
Absolutely. Well, the
crime, and it is
hyperinflation
a
is
crime
real.
that can be put at the...
What is the solution going forward in terms of ending this crisis?
I would say absolutely. There needs to be facilitated negotiation. The Chavista side must take part in any kind
Negotiation to what end, though? You're not being clear as to what's the end point of those negotiations. Is it new elections? Is it Maduro?
There should be new elections that should take place at some point, but to get
which
there...
Maduro can contest.
To get there, well, I don't think, personally, I don't think he should participate. There are plenty of other candidates that should play a role, but I think that a main point is that the Chavista side must be included because it represents still to this day a majority of people in Venezuela. They cannot be excluded, they cannot be repressed or isolated.
Do you disagree with that solution? Well, I don't think there should be negotiations with Maduro, period. I think that the international community should remain strong, and I think that there should continue to be encouragement of negotiations between many of the Chavista politicians, many of the Democratic opposition politicians, and the leadership of the military.
You just ignore the president?
No, to eventually come to an agreement that says that we are unified, that we no longer want to be misruled by Maduro. Well, let's revisit it in 6 months.
Well,
but I think that over time,
in
that
a year,
will
they
work.
could call for a recall referendum, but then they'd have to recognize the legitimacy of his presidency. But there is a figure in the Constitution that would allow for his term to be recalled.
We'll have to leave it there. Eva Golinger, Eli Lake, thank you both for joining me on the show. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.